Welcome to everyone for this occasion at which we will be celebrating and discussing the new work of our colleague Ellen Morris, Famine and Feast in Ancient Egypt. I'll start by thanking the Heyman Center for organizing this event. And I see I have 3 minutes. I will be very quick about it. I'll just say this is a book that packs a hell of a punch. It's really, really remarkable. In fact, it reminded me of two other books, which I brought with me. Colin Turnbull's The Mountain People, a portrait of what happens to a society under the terrible stress of famine. It is admittedly a book that is now discredited. The EEC actually sued Colin Turnbull for reputational damage, and that's not a parallel to your book, I'm sure. But it certainly the gripping narrative certainly was one feature that I was share with that book. And the other one is Catherine Merridale's Night of Stone, the account of death and memory in Soviet Russia, which has a harrowing account of the Holodomor, of the famine in the Ukraine. And one thing that you also bring out is the way in which famine is experienced and seen. And so these are really traits that make this book a very, very remarkable and memorable book. It's one of the most memorable things I've read recently. I mean, it shows your mastery of history, your mastery of comparative history. You draw on Ottoman stuff, as well as the record of the 1956 famine in China, which are very striking passages. You're a very skilled reader of text, a view of images, a social and cultural historian of memory. It's a really wonderful and very complete book in a small compass. And of course, it is very relevant to nowadays when we see climate change bringing climate refugees. So it's a really extraordinary read, and I highly recommend it. I'm very pleased to say that we have a whole panel of specialists to respond. We have Joe Manning, Egyptologist from Yale. We have Nancy Werman from Barnard, a literary critic and a critical theorist, and we have Zoe Crossland, an archaeologist. All these people just for you. What we don't have is actual piles and piles of this book for you to buy afterwards from some sort of failure of Cambridge University Press. We don't actually have the book for you to pick up, but I highly recommend it. You can borrow my copy if you want. It's a really wonderful piece of work. So thank you, Ellen, for coming here, and thank you to all of us.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, John. I'd like to preface this introductory framing statement, which I'll read in the interests of my 8-minute time limit. I'd like to preface it by thanking the Heyman Center, John, who suggested that I submit the element to the Heyman, the panelists whose attention at this time of the semester especially is a gift of which I am very appreciative, and my interlocutors, many of whom are in the room. At its essence, Famine and Feast in Ancient Egypt is a meditation on how societies actively strive to remember the type of communal trauma that those who lived through it would prefer to forget, something all of us, I think, can empathize with. Unlike earthquakes that encode memory into piles of rubble, famines appear and disappear far quicker than the tremendous tumult and trauma that they cause would suggest. With a renewed food supply, emaciated bodies resume their former shape, new generations are born into plenty, and within a decade or so, populations are generally restored to what they were. Thus, the entire experience of famine, engulfed in the normalcy that preceded and followed it, dissipates like a nightmare, its scars invisible, and its cautionary tales particularly difficult to impart. Hero narratives attract audiences, but extended and severe famines produce no enduring heroes, nor even heroic suffering. As a diarist who survived the nearly 2.5-year German blockade of Leningrad, in which several 100,000 people perished of starvation, put it, quote, "Heroism, self-sacrifice, the heroic feat. Only those who are full or who haven't been hungry long are capable of those. As for us, we came to know a hunger that degraded and crushed us, that turned us into animals." Thus, like many veterans of hard-fought wars, survivors of famine rarely discuss their experience to those who could not possibly understand it. And for those that do break their silence out of a fear that societal amnesia will invite a repetition of trauma, many find to their dismay that their narratives are regarded with suspicion or distaste. But not remembering and not believing in the worst case scenarios of famine or war does make a society vulnerable. So in this element, and it's an element actually, not a book, I wanted to think about how Egyptians kept terrible famines in mind, even when nobody alive had ever experienced anything more severe than a relatively routine food crisis. Medieval and Ottoman texts, an increasing number of well-dated environmental proxies leave no doubt that intensely traumatic famines capable of killing tens of thousands of people, often with the aid of communicable viruses that prey on malnourished bodies, struck Egypt perhaps every century or century and a half. Thinking through accounts of famine in Egypt, then, it seemed to me that the primary places where one does find accounts of famine were either not well suited to be sites of memory or suffered from issues of reception. Autobiographical accounts of famine in tombs or steles, for example, would have been difficult to access. So too, as has been rightly noted, tomb owners were very invested in portraying themselves as heroes. And I suspect this is because, as cross-cultural and cross-temporal examples demonstrate, elites were at least as likely to hoard and to profiteer as they were to act for the common good. There are also emphatically pessimistic texts that circulated in a literary sphere. In diametrical opposition to the autobiographical texts, these narrators give free rein to anguish and pain. And indeed, the extravagance of their internal suffering is in part what often leads to their dismissal as sources for social history. Finally, there are the so-called prophetic texts that, with one exception, come from the Greco-Roman period and quote unquote predict an ecological trouble, which, as in the autobiographical and also the pessimistic texts, a side effect of famine was civil strife. But the authors of these prophecies, as scholars have noted, are primarily interested in mobilizing ecological crises for political ends. Graphic reports of terrible famines in pessimistic texts and in prophecies face similar issues of reception. Angst-filled explorations of pain, whether in antiquity or today, are no one's idea of a good time. And for their part, prophecies don't tend to be believed unless contemporary conditions render them likely. Thus, most so-called prophecies of famines were likely both written and read in times of impending crisis. So this got me interested in Jan Assmann's discussion of Jewish tradition and its unusual emphasis on the preservation and transmission of what he calls counterfactual memory. That is, inherited memories that bear little resemblance to anything a people have experienced in their own lifetimes. Memories of privation in a time of plenty obviously count. Assmann lists 7 strategies that the Jewish tradition has utilized to preserve memories of persecution, even at points in their history during which that population felt safe. Most interesting to me was the use of festivals of remembrance that a Jewish auditor in my Egypt in the Classical World class once neatly summarized as, "They tried to kill us, they didn't succeed, now let's eat." Thus, the last section of the element, I argue that the most successful strategy the Egyptians possessed for keeping the specter of terrible famines in mind was likely the New Year's festival. We know, for example, that the New Year's festival was prefaced by 5 days that were held to be ill-omened and on which, one can argue, many joyous activities were prohibited. Then, on the day on which the Nile was believed to begin rising from its lowest point in the annual cycle, festivals were held that invited adults to overindulge in alcohol and sex, but before all that, to tell tales to children. The most important of these related how, when the goddess and her floodwaters departed in anger to Nubia, social order became inverted, such that the formerly oppressed now ruled. And this was narrated in the tale of an upstart mouse who managed to overthrow a cat army. This theme of social inversion is interestingly emphasized in both pessimistic texts and prophecies as having stemmed from the societal anger brought on by famines and also by worker shortages in the aftermath of mass mortality. As each of us remembers well, due to our own great resignation and current rash of strikes, workers enjoy unusual leverage when replacements are hard to find. I end the element then by arguing that for the ancient inhabitants of the Northern Nile Valley, as for many observant Jews, the most effective manner for transmitting the awareness of a potentially recurrent but seemingly unlikely tragedy was to embed it in a festival whose attendant next step joy makes both children and adults eagerly await the chance to issue these warnings once again, and then to eat, drink, and be merry. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Ellen. Thank you for inviting me. I feel like in this room, especially, I'm among friends and in civilization, which is really nice in these current times we are living in. It's actually a treat, even though we're talking about famine. It's nice to be here. This is a really stimulating book for an element, for a short book. And you remind me that there's even more work to do. So I was really happy to read through this, actually a couple of times. It's a great example of historical imagination, which I think John even hinted at. It really is. How you work is fascinating and really important in that respect. And if I may say, it's sort of, you reveal the real ancient Egypt, the dynamic of a society. Really, it's so important because we tend to not think about it with all the kind of texts you bring to bear, even the literary texts, like the pessimistic literature, so-called, which is so often disregarded as exaggerated, as opposed to reflecting real events. It's sort of, wow, these are the Middle Kingdom pharaohs saying, look how bad that time was. You really need us. But no, there's something real here that you sort of underline, which I think is rather important. Now we know, because I'm working on this a lot, it's on the top of my mind, Nile flood variability, which you mentioned, which is the important aspect of Egyptian civilization: flood, recession, agriculture, Nile variability, which now we know quite a lot about. And we know the drivers of it. One, El Nino years, of course, and that's probably echoed in the 7 years of feast and famine in several places, including the famine. See, that is probably some echo of the El Nino variability, which is directly impacting the East African monsoon, but also volcanic eruptions, which we now know year by year, which we can now date, interestingly, which is really opening up at least Greco-Roman Egypt and beyond, further into the modern world. And you can reconstruct now, as we're doing now, flood variability year by year from the Ptolemaic period forward, which is super exciting. So I think we're going to have even more information linking the experiences you bring up with Ottoman Egypt, medieval Egypt, kind of broadly, and earlier, that variability and the impacts of food supply, food crises, famine, and disease, always attendant. It's there, even if we don't see it. It is no doubt there. You bring up painful events and memory, and my anthropology colleague may have more to say, but I thought of Harvey Whitehouse's work on dysphoric experiences and social cooperation. Those are linked, and through ritual as well. His book, The Ritual Animal, is a really interesting treatment of that, for example. So that kind of thing is also was so interesting to read in the book, because I think it's important as reinforcing the real threat of famine, which must have been on the mind of everyone all the time, given the variability. And for the Egyptians, even the unpredictability of such things, particularly when El Ninos or Alaskan volcanoes are not on the mental map of anybody in ancient Egypt. These are the drivers of East African variability, totally outside of their system, which highlights even more what you want to say. I think. What else did I want to say? The prophecy literature is so interesting, and you mentioned even the earlier, like the prophecy of Nefertiti, of solar dimming, which is all over the Greco-Roman prophecies as well. I'm thinking Oracle Potter specifically. That solar dimming, I am very tempted to say, and it's always interpreted as the sun god turning away from Egypt and abandoning Egypt, maybe metaphorically, but it is actually literally a visual description of the impact of large volcanic eruptions on the atmosphere and sulfate circulation hemispherically, which is the driver of East African suppression. So it is quite possible, certainly with the large eruptions, that Egyptians are observing the actual sun being dimmed, as opposed to just metaphor. It's actually real. We're actually describing the real world. And the Oracle of the Potter, I'm so intrigued by, because the literature of that is the size of the planet Jupiter, actually, this, on the Oracle of the Potter. So metaphorical in its understanding. But if you read the Oracle of the Potter extremely literally, from the solar dimming to the seeds not responding to the soil, the soil is unusually dry. There's a reversal of the winds, which are the monsoonal winds, which does happen. It does reach the Nile Valley when the monsoon is hitting East Africa, and it does reverse. And then the mechanisms, the invasion, the taxman coming, but the farmers can't pay the taxman, the social disruption, the whole thing gives us literally the mechanisms of volcanic forcing on the Nile flood. It's actually quite remarkable as literally a text. There may be metaphor as well, but literally it's giving us the mechanisms and the societal responses, which is incredible. So even more detail of what you're saying, I'm tempted to say, if I'm not completely out of my mind, this is the actual human world of Egypt that they're responding, and they're thinking about for political purposes, as you well emphasize. I think it's quite dramatic and quite scary. And in fact, the text has a long editing history. It's Ptolemaic. It may go back further. It actually doesn't matter for me. But the copies we have are 3rd century CE, which is exactly when you have huge volcanic eruptions again after the quiescent period, we're calling it, of the first 2 centuries AD. So it's relevant when you have huge volcanic eruptions again impacting the Nile River, which it did in the 3rd century CE again. So these texts are relevant because somebody's pulling them out going, even though 6, 7 centuries or more old, here's the mechanism. Here's what might happen. And the temple as the repository of cultural memory here is, and the priests are really an important thing. You stress rituals for sure. That's so fascinating, so important. But the role of temples, quite literally, to preserve cultural memory, but also this is the place of grain storage. So again, the work to be done in the real world of Egypt is, which is harder, is what about grain storage? What about grain distribution in a world where grain can be stored for 2 years? That's your resilience. Beyond 2 years, you are screwed. That's the technical term, right? But, but in a place like Egypt, you can store grain if you can keep the critters away and the moisture away for a couple of years, but you're in trouble. And we know from documentary papyri that there are periods when there's no flood for 3 years. So you can actually begin to quantify, that's probably going to be a really bad moment. Or, okay, 1 year of now flood, we're okay, as long as we can distribute grain around. And I'll show you our hydrological modeler, which has never been done. Actually, I'm thrilled. I was talking to a couple of people before. We've now modeled the floodplain with real water on the floodplain, and it's remarkable. We can actually see where the water hits and where it doesn't hit year by year, depending on the quality of the flood, which we can also kind of tweak now. So you can see on the floodplain, it's a modern floodplain. It's the same as the ancient floodplain because we've mapped all the towns and villages. So you can actually get a dynamic about what places now specifically might be in trouble. But you can sort of quantify 1 bad year, no problem. 3 bad years, problem. You can sort of now we can sort of look we can't go so far back. We can do Ptolemaic and Roman now. So that's interesting. One more text, which is really interesting, which I don't think you mentioned, but it's one of my favorite texts, is the Canopus Decree, which again is in the priestly realm, 237 BC, but refers back to events in the 240s where we know there were two huge eruptions, massive eruptions, 247, 245. Ptolemy III recalled from the Third Syrian War after one successful year at the gates of Babylon. He could have put paid to the Seleucids, but he had to go back because there were internal troubles, which almost certainly is massive now, river failure and social disruption. And in that text, it says, there came a year with a very low Nile. I think it's several years in a row. And the hearts of all men and women in Egypt were smitten with grief. Sorry, this is like not my translation, it's a bit old translation, but I just wrote it down quickly. Smitten. Because there came into their minds the memory of the misery and deprivation which had come upon the Egyptians during their own time when the low Nile came in the reign of former kings. And then Ptolemy III, the hero, grabs grain somehow, apparently, this is a mystery to me, what the mechanism of that were, in external territories, imports grain into Egypt, basically. How that worked, I have no idea, and saves the day somehow. It's a remarkable event that I'm stunned by it, and I take it seriously now. And I think now, because we can tie the huge eruptions into, no doubt now, river failure in the mid 240s, which is an important year also for all sorts of irrigation machines apparently get introduced in the 240s. Think Archimedes, for example. I mean, this is a really important, so that's a really interesting thing where it actually says we remember a former time when there was famine, and oh shit, are we facing that again? Pardon my language. But I mean, it's a fascinating text. It just supports exactly what you say, but other things too about what kings are doing. So it's even more interesting, I think. Actual food shortages. One last thing about Cleopatra and the Okmuk eruption. You mentioned the 44 eruption. The Okmuk, the Alaskan one, is 43 BC now, January, February. That's been dated by the team here in the Now Project. And there was famine because we know Cleopatra opened up the royal granaries in the late 40s BC. Massive famine, by the way, in China in the same years. It's monsoon failure, Indian Ocean wide. And there is also disease because apparently Cleopatra's physician describes whatever this disease was, whether it's plague or not. But so there is also Nile failure and disease in those years. I'm convinced. The impact of Rome, some of our interlocutors don't like what we say about it, but this is the largest eruption in the last 2,500 years in the Northern Hemisphere, which impacted the Nile, not for 1 year, 2 years, but a decade. It's a decade of cooling and several years of Nile flood failures in a row. And we have a biography of the governor of Upper Egypt in the 39 BC, who says there was famine, who saves the day in his region, classic text, right? Which is so interesting. So it just sort of confirms what you're saying, and we can extend this. And I think there's lots more work to do. Thank you very much for writing this book.
In case you hadn't realized, Joe Manning is a papyrologist, but also a climate historian, I think. So thank you. That was really, really wonderful, especially the Canopus Decree. Nancy.
Thanks for this, Ellen. It's very funny to follow Joe because I really don't work with the real. I really only work in the realm of metaphor, so we're kind of a perfect pair. There's that. And then also speaking fully from the corner of ignorance. This is not my area. I read this book with great interest. I learned a ton. It was really, really engaging, very informative, and focused on things that I am interested in from a different angle, namely how environmental and geopolitical phenomena shape the lives of ancient and some modern communities. This deftly managed exploration of the surviving images and narratives centering on Egypt across a vast time span not only tracks sustained efforts to manage natural disaster, it also includes thoughtful discussions of such phenomena as individuals' responses to community devastation and starvation, as she was detailing, introducing a cross-cultural and temporal perspective to ponder human suffering at the granular level as a series of horrifying choices. Something very timely there. The study moves up and down the social scale from authoritative declarations to witness accounts, including intimate struggles, such as those of what I found most moving, a man and his ba, speaking to his soul. In a study that in general manages to be both sensitive and deep, these close-ups are especially delicately handled, as L juxtaposes ancient Egyptian witnesses to those of modern man-made catastrophes like World War II, and I do mean man-made, as well as its aftermath. So while it wasn't always clear to what extent the ancient accounts record the effects of human wrongs rather than natural disasters or a combination of both, parallels emerge across the time periods that are revealing, such as the turn to an addressable you. This is Michael Levine's phrase. He uses it when talking about modern witness literature, and that's the address to one's soul or one's heart, which L discusses very briefly. Some of the more formal oracular texts, in contrast, suggest the existence of a brand of official writing that we might recognize as engaging in social policing, akin to modern-day threat levels and the like. From this angle, what scholars of literature tend to cluster as plague narratives, tales about oracles, and at least some tragic plots would all participate in such attempts at social control. That is, rather than regard drought and famine as natural phenomena utterly divorced from human agency, the written record suggests that ancient communities, including Egyptian, Jewish, Greek, and Roman, took themselves to be implicated. Or rather, those in charge, politically and culturally, perpetuated a set of conventions that sought to warn their communities about disasters, past, present, and future, that and thus to frighten them into good, that is to say, compliant behavior by means of narratives that purport to have divine origins. And I'm thinking here of Herodotus's Delphic tales. They tend to follow a pattern like that. That is to say, human neglect of the gods brings on plague, say, you better behave yourselves. The situation in Thucydides is more complicated. Lisa Callett has an interesting paper on that, but that's for discussion. If anybody else is interested besides me. I'm looking at John. But as Elle's discussion repeatedly makes clear, so that's one way of understanding things. And of course, being a literature person, I'm trying to think about narrative shaping and so forth. The Egyptian writings, like others in adjacent traditions, are more complicated than this in their details. And I thought that one way to approach this complexity might be to consider who these mouthpieces of the gods are exactly. Some are priests, like Nefertiti, as Joe referred to, but others are maybe, or at least apparently, lowly figures like the potter and the lamb. And these oracular narratives are distinct from others that L groups as witness accounts, as she was also thinking through. Taken together, though, they capture dynamics familiar from narratives of geopolitical crises in the ancient record, broadly speaking, the most famous of which is likely the story of Oedipus. This tale, and those like it, date back to Homer. A plague precipitated by human transgression, that is, a king's seizure of a priest's daughter, opens the Iliad very famously, and Oedipus himself is referred to, if only in passing, in the Odyssey. We know he's around in those really old stories. The oracular voice in the Oedipus story belongs to a priest, famously, again, Tiresias, and some versions clearly paint this role as the unwelcome one of being a divine mouthpiece talking back to kings. Prophetic declarations in this Greek tradition often arouse confusion and conflict, as in many of Herodotus's stories about the Delphic oracle. Such predictions largely concern high-status families and/or powerful leaders who do not like to be faced with ambiguity, let alone the consequences of their transgressions or their failings, the like. The predictions of the priest Nefertiti and the lamb, I was just taking a couple of examples, in contrast, describe devastations that are more global and not necessarily tied to specific wrongs. Rather, geopolitical disaster will ensue, and the bonds between humans and gods will fray. The lamb prophecy, which purports to record the sayings of this talkative animal, features hymn-like punctuations that also sound like pitiful bleats, I thought. Like, weep, Memphis, weep, Thebes.
Very nice.
You like that?
Very good.
My literary ear. So there's There's the lammy exclamations, as well as curses of a sort that I thought were familiar in ancient literature more generally. The latter center on blights of the land and the people, that is, breakdowns in the fertility cycle, including parched earth and perishing or shrunken children. In the Greco-Roman record, similar curses can be found in magic spells as well as in tragedy, such as the priest's recounting of barren lands and wombs at the outset of Sophocles' Oedipus the King, or the Furies' curses on the house of Atreus in Seneca's Thyestes. Some of the students here know this, and she says, let the children die miserably and let them be born even worse. But unlike these morally challenged heroes who tend to bristle at and then attempt to elude such predictions, the pharaoh's response to the lamb is reverent. When the lamb finishes everything he has to say, he promptly dies, after which the scribes take him and his prophecy to the pharaoh. He orders that the lamb be settled in a golden shrine and buried like a god, despite the fact that the lamb had declared that the disasters he predicted for Egypt would occur during the pharaoh's lifetime. This is all to say that the narrative arc of such oracular texts, if we can think of it like that, encompasses widespread devastation and suffering, as in tragic tales more generally, and yet concludes with what looks like the opposite, that is, the elevation of the prophet to special status. Well, except that he's dead, as if his words themselves were literally, physically devastating. The prophecies of Nefertiti are also received with reverence. Indeed, the frame text states that the pharaoh himself took up pen and paper, so to speak, palette and scroll, I think, and wrote them down. So he very, very respectfully played secretary. William Simpson, author of The Literature of Ancient Egypt, a collection from 2003 that includes some of the writings that Elle discusses, explains in an introduction the range of texts he has included. He notes that there is no Egyptian word for narrative, which is very striking from a literary perspective, and categorizes a great portion of the text as instructive or religious tales and sayings. I take it that prophetic and oracular texts would fall under this rubric, although scholars have considered some of them as the literature of pessimism that I was talking about before, which again includes also these intimate accounts of human sufferings that I started with, I mentioned at the beginning of this little talk. This lack of a term for narrative, which in Greek is mythos or Latin fabula maybe, suggests something unusual to me, at least, about the assumptions that might underlie these tales and sayings. Their didactic nature seems to be bound up with religious practices on the one hand and lived lives on the other, which suggests that conventional notions of genre boundaries don't actually capture much of what is distinctive and noteworthy about these stories, which is very disappointing to me. I was looking. As opposed to that, as opposed to my attempt to think about narrative, just the wrong rubric, Elle's cultural and material history approach, in great contrast, reveals the ways in which prophetic texts overlap with witness histories in relating geopolitical disasters from without and within, so to speak. In this way, predictions of devastation, which I would think of as the outside long view, dovetail with expressions of individual suffering, effectively filling in both sides of the story. The study thereby opens a wider window on such crises that, together with precisely situated material artifacts, reveals the sadly iterative rhythms of geopolitical crises and human attempts to manage their impacts. So this is all to say that Elle's discussion has encouraged me to think about literary and religio-cultural practices from a prospect that foregrounds how embedded these are in communities' struggles for control of unruly natural cycles, which I really don't think about very much. Thank you for all those details. And their attempts to control these cycles often result in conflicts with other communities and with each other, which is, again, as people have been saying, a very timely emphasis, not just environmentally speaking, but given the new crisis that is facing us abroad. So I wanted to end my remarks with a broad question that circles back to where I started. I wonder whether the knowledge that one's suffering is a result of human aggression, like the siege of Leningrad, or again, conflicts like right now, rather than natural devastation, such as the flooding of the Nile, affects how these tales unfold, including tone and focus. That is, in the ancient narratives, the crises always involve environmental aspects, while the modern ones do not, or at least not on the surface. And while the ancient often include human wrongs, these are mostly depicted as precipitated by natural disasters, or at least as being in cyclical relation to them. Right? Thank you. Thanks so much for this.
Thank you, Nancy. I think we'll want to talk about this problem of whether natural disasters and social disasters are linked and what the link is. I think we're very lucky to have Elle as a colleague. That's one thing I derived from your paper. Zoe. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for the invitation to be on this amazing panel and part of this wonderful event. I do feel like a bit of an interloper because I know very little about ancient Egypt. I mostly work in more recent time periods. And I guess I'd like to talk a little bit about the secondary narrative that is unspoken that runs through the text, which is the climate crisis that we're living in right now, and that seemed very present to me in the book. It's a small book, but there's so much packed in it. You know, for fans of Doctor Who, it's a TARDIS of a book, right? You can just go in and start exploring. I mean, there's really I learned a lot, but it also opened up lots of questions for me to follow up on. It's a wonderful book in its exploration of how ancient Egypt's experience an unexpected social upheaval and tragedy, how they, to quote Elle, how they remember famine in the midst of a life filled with feasts. And this sort of central question of how in pharaonic and Greco-Roman Egypt, these infrequent but devastating episodes of famine were registered in social memory is so fascinating to think about. And I think that's what I'd like to sort of talk about a bit now. It made me think about Amitav Ghosh's 2016 book, right? The Great Derangement. And in that book, he looks at climate change and he asks, why is it so unimaginable as part of the story in the novelistic fiction that we've inherited? And he notes how the novel is tied to an expectation of place that is predictable, expected, controllable. And there's, he argues that there's little scope in this sort of realist novel for thinking about devastating climate events or for non-human actors, for gods, for animals. And he notes also how the Anthropocene defies the boundaries of place and time as imagined in the novel. And I think this book responds in many ways to this question of how to write about, how to narrativize climate change, how to think and talk about dramatic climate events by exploring these different forms of witness testimony, prophecy, and then rites of remembrance. And this question of how to make accounts of interest is really fascinating to me. How do you get people to listen? And you mentioned that people pay most attention when they're under threat, and in some ways, that's when you least need to pay attention, right? You need to pay attention in the moments when we need to maintain and convey that memory. And right now, of course, we're paying attention because we all feel under threat. And you wonder how many stories have gone unnoticed because of this lack of sense of threat. And as Ghosh outlines, the question of how we make stories relevant and pass them on to future generations and also to people within the contemporary population is really a live issue. It's really the live issue of our time. How do we do this? And one way that this book sort of brought to mind for me is the way that Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed have suggested in relation to Australian Aborigine stories, which encode long-term memories of post-glacial sea level rise, they argue. So, for example, the drowning of Port Phillip Bay, where Melbourne is situated around 7,000 years or more before present. They argue that's encoded in these mythic stories. And they look also at the wider Asia-Pacific region where there's the possibility of these short-lived but reversible coastal changes, things like cyclones and tsunamis. And there are stories about islands disappearing because of the gods stamping repeatedly on the ground surface, causing the land to rise or to sink, an emergence of islands. These are documented geologically. And they argue that these sorts of long-term histories are encoded in kin-based obligations. So there's a sort of structure for these stories to be encoded. And so that was something I was wondering about and thinking about too. What are the structures through which these stories get reproduced and handed down? And then, you talk about witness testimony and prophecy as two of these modes. And, that was sort of reading this and thinking, this is where we're living right now. These are the forms of narrative that we live among, these sort of deeply pessimistic and unrelenting narratives with a certain hopelessness, right, about what's happening and what's taking place. But then another way, as you show, is to make the stories sort of fun and risky, right? To develop rites of remembrance that sort of activate a kind of carnivalesque. And Ellen argues for the annual Festival of Remembrance as central in maintaining the memory of famine through this carnivalesque inversion of social hierarchy, in which the real and imagined inversions caused by famine were remembered and dramatized through these wonderful animal tales. And I just love King Mouse reigning and forcing the cats to serve the mice with great deference. Is, you know, the images are just wonderful. There's something inherently humorous about that, you know, just about this inversion. But it also, as you mentioned, contains the memory of rodent attacks at the same time on storehouses at times of famine. And there's this risk there, and how humans and animals can come into competition at these moments. You know, and Bakhtin, of course, we can't talk about the carnivalesque without mentioning Bakhtin. He describes it as bodily participation in the potentiality of another world. And this is another world that's forged from what exists, from what we have, but it redeploys and reworks that world as it's known to sort of imagine things that are repressed, and through that to imagine alternate futures. There's a utopianism there in the carnival, as Bakhtin describes it. And it's a world that plays with boundaries as well. You know, the boundaries of the social body, the inversions of the social body, but also the grotesque, you know, the physical body. And that made me think too, I was sort of thinking about the sort of dynamic shifting of the Nile floods, the movement between land and water, and the sort of how that might play in, if at all, to thinking about these transgressive boundaries. It kind of, the way in which Carnival gives us a space to think about a changing and unstable world seemed kind of very productive to me. And you know, of course, there's a risk to this, and Peter Stalabras and Alan White, in their quite old book now in 1986, they note how often carnival and riots collide. And I wondered then about the risks, particularly to the Egyptian elites in these stories, in imagining other futures and remembering traumatic pasts. You know, what work are they doing to try and stabilize, to retrench, to refuse these inversions? And of course, this is all relevant today, right, for thinking about what's going on in the present. So, you know, there's a risk to carnival, but it's a risk worth taking. And in the moment we're in right now, the sort of future orientation of the carnivalesque that Bakhtin identifies seems really important. And as Stalabras and White note, the carnival has come to seen in literary studies as a kind of mode of understanding, as a festive critique. And I wonder about that, you know, how can we operationalize that festive critique today? You know, recent studies of climate change narratives have shown how the current narratives of unrecoverable climate disorder and chaos can lead to paralysis. You know, people just feel paralyzed by the relentlessness of these narratives and the lack of hope. Feelings of, you know, what's the point? There's no solution. And so I guess, you know, in the time that remains afterwards in the discussion, you know, maybe it would be interesting to think about what kind of risky fun or festive critique can we search for in narrative to help all of us pay attention, to feel that it's worth attending to this question, and that there's some kind of future that we can address and respond to based on this accumulated memory and experience of humans and non-humans across the planet. So yeah, how might we, like the ancient Egyptians, I guess, bring in a recognition of the non-human in these forms of remembrance and anticipation to imagine different futures for ourselves? And I'll leave that there. Thank
you. That was sobering. Ellen, you now have some time to respond to all of these very pointed and interesting interventions.
Fine. Okay, I just want to start off by saying how moved I am that you all agreed and how influential, all of you have been for me. Joe, your work has completely reshaped the way I think we think about what's happening in the Ptolemaic period. For those of you who don't follow the Ptolemaic period, its history is kind of a shit show, and it used to be thought of because just the Ptolemies were completely odious, and sort of in every possible way. However, your work with the volcanic suppressions of the monsoons have really made everybody look back at texts like the prophecies and solar dimming and that sort of a thing, to see that there really is an attempt to that it's not that people are just going crazy. It's that there's something that's driving them to it, and that one of the things that I found again and again, I mean, this has come up in the discussion, is the role of elites, the role of people with the grain, in either helping or harming. And I think we all saw that in the coronavirus with people who were, buying up all the toilet paper and, West Side, versus people who were, really helping. And so to think with your work was very, very important to me. And also, this real interest, you were talking about the Cleopatra and, and the sun. And there was, even, was it Mark Antony who was talking about how the sun was dimming because it couldn't stand what happened to Caesar, which is, all of these ways that one tries to understand what's happening is very, very interesting and very important. And I hadn't thought about El Nino particularly in that 7-year cycle, which I'm fascinated to think with. And I also want to know more about your floodplain. So, but it's fascinating. It's amazing. It's so helpful, and all the work that you're doing and thinking through crises that are hitting India is as well. You had your student who didn't end up coming to Columbia, who had worked, who we tried to woo to get here, who was doing really interesting things kind of under your direction to think more widely. But you brought up the crucial role of temples, and that brings us to Nancy, who is very humble about not knowing anything, but I think she's read more than even my family members over there of my work, because she was on my tenure. She led my tenure charge. And so I'm deeply thankful for your comments and for your thoughtfulness as a colleague. And so thinking about suffering and the question of what's different about natural suffering versus man-made disasters, in a way, I think it's almost impossible to put a line in there, because every natural disaster gets exacerbated by cleavages in human societies. And so I think, you have the people, as with New Orleans, who are living in the most vulnerable areas, as no doubt they were in Egypt as well, getting sort of short shrift and being especially vulnerable. And sort of one thing that you find, or that I found both in the Egyptian texts and looking outward, because I felt like I looked outward so much, because point is, none of us have lived through a famine, so there's a big question of what would a Nilotic famine even look like? What would it be like? And so one thing that both of them had was kind of the suffering of wage workers, because wage workers are the ones who are the first line of when you cut corners, you cut corners against wage workers. And so that sort of anybody who's seen to be not sharing at that point comes into such societal anger, and that's a societal anger that causes the Ptolemies, to be facing revolt after revolt after revolt, which is really interesting. And Zoe, I just wanted to say you feel like the outlier, but you were exactly, I was so excited to have you accept in terms of thinking anthropologically and thinking of, with festivals and the sort of world upside down, sort of aspect of it, and also ways anthropologically that long-term, memory is handed down as a survival mechanism in many cases, which I think is extremely important, and is something that we don't sort of normally think of. And the Bakhtin carnival kind of inversions in how everything gets mixed, different people get mixed, and people get mixed up, and the high is low and the low is high. And this is something that you see over and over again in the carnival, and then also in elite laments that have to do with the Black Death and aftermath of the Black Death. You have people really completely feeling, it's histrionic on the elite part, but the sort of feeling like they were once at the top and now they're not, and new people are at the top. And so this is something that I was just fascinated by, because it shows up in absolutely every single genre that says the rich are now poor and the poor are now rich, and the people that used to give commands are now are taking commands, and the world is completely upside down. So it's fun, to like nothing. What is fun about famine? Nothing is fun about famine. But if that's a kind of memory that gets, I'm gonna make sure it's got 8 seconds, so I don't want my alarm to go off like it does in class all the time, telling me to be quiet. But that these kinds of topsy-turvy, like what I thought was fascinating, what you mentioned about the riots and the carnivals, because what it is it's flirting with disaster. It's sort of flirting with the sort of it's topsy-turvy, but what if it stays that way? And it keeps in mind craziness that happens when the flood goes away, or the goddess is away, or the king is no longer here. But it also keeps that memory intact for people in the the lower stratums, that revolutions can succeed, and that's something that under strong kings or autocratic rulers of any sort, you sort of have to keep that memory alive till you can act on it, which was super super interesting. So I think that's my 8 minutes.
Thank you. Well, do I need to say? Well, thank you. I read the book. I enjoyed reading the book, and it's indeed packed with lots of things. And I know most of the book is indeed about memory, not rather about facts, but underlying the book and also underlying the discussion, there is this oh, is this based on fact, on the real famines and so on? And Joe Manning has pointed out for the late period. But so of course, the literature that you quote, Puer, etc., deals with this, what you call nicely the long first intermediate period, which indeed is often, portrayed as this moment of famine, this moment of whatever decline of Egypt. On the other hand, there's a very strong lobby amongst the Egyptologists, including, one of the editors of the series, Juan Carlos Moreno Garcia, who called this a period of economic growth. So how do you square these two things?
It's fascinating, and the work of Juan Carlos Moreno Garcia and also Nadine Moeller, who's at Chicago, has been absolutely fundamental in kind of rethinking a sort of, it used to be that people would read these, terrible accounts and then say, well, that, that's what they're seeing. Interestingly, people who were reading it right after Bolshevik Revolution and World War II were like, yes, that's it. That's what we're seeing. However, there's also that's too simple, and that there are indeed elites who want to be seen as the heroes, in the story, sort of as you brought up Cleopatra's, person who was claiming to save the day. What I think is that, and Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror was crucial to me in thinking about she talks about the long 14th century, but basically it's a time period in which you can't characterize it as one thing. And so to characterize it as unremitting horror is missing, the sort of really high living that was going on and the creativity that was going on. Yet to deny that there was, in fact, a trauma that was so intense that it left its mark everywhere, and that you don't see it, you see it a little bit at the end of the New Kingdom, but you don't see it in spades again until Ptolemaic period, when you start to see it a lot. And so it's, I wanted to try and understand, and that was the kind of going into the medieval and the Ottoman, like, what do these things look like? How often do they happen? What happens when they happen? And what happens when they happen is, is just really awful stuff. And so I think that basically you can say, I think that tens of thousands of people likely died in some of these episodes, and the sort of different climate proxies are such that it's really hard to explain all of them away. On the other hand, that's not all that was happening, and it wasn't happening everywhere, and it wasn't happening to everybody. So that would be how I'd do it. I would say that it wasn't uniform suffering, but it was punctuated, and it was terrible enough that it left a scar akin to Black Death scar, or akin to potato famine, or these other kind of periods where it's really hard to get past that, and it's a benchmark for suffering.
I'm afraid I haven't read the book, but I've really enjoyed this discussion. I will read the book.
It's really short, so that was the only way I could possibly intrude on my colleagues.
But it gave me a lot to think about. I mean, particularly from the perspective of Ptolemaic history, and I guess one of the first things that comes to mind is the relationship between famine and democracy. Amartya Sen's work on India and looking at how, in fact, famines shouldn't have to happen, really, and how in ancient societies people deal with famine. And it's come up several times in this discussion, the role that social actors play in exacerbating or even causing famine. And it's interesting, especially in the Ptolemaic period, that you see two very different approaches to famine in the Greek world and in Egypt. So there was a big famine at the end of the 4th century in Greece, and a governor of Egypt appointed by Alexander, Cleomenes, exacerbated it by charging huge prices for Egyptian grain and taking the grain from Egypt, whereas Cyrene, a Greek city, organized with very similar means a big pile of grain that they could sell to the Greek cities for very low prices, and they set up a decree showing how generous they were. And Greek cities created panels of officials who were there to make sure that grain supplies were available at reasonable prices. And of course, it's only for citizens. And so we can't talk about democracy in the way that we think about modern people. I mean, even in a crisis like that in a Greek city-state, many people would have died needlessly. But it's interesting that this would have been something that Egyptians were very much aware of in the Ptolemaic period, if only because they were dealing or living in a society in which there were Greek polis in Egypt, Alexandria, Naucratis, and Ptolemaeus. And we see in the reign of Cleopatra the impact of these famines, particularly in Alexandria. And we have a decree from Cleopatra saying that all the grain has to go to Alexandria, all of it. And she's really getting really tough on all the officials. Don't keep back any grain. We need all of the grain. And this must have had a huge negative effect on the Egyptian population. All of these different villages that must have been suffering under it. So, as Joe mentioned, with the Canopus decree, Ptolemy III could present himself as a great hero in a very Egyptian context, in a trilingual decree, bringing grain in, showing how important the empire was, providing grain to the people. So it's something that was obviously lacking in most famines in the Egyptian world because of these social problems. So it's just not surprising to me that famine particularly in the oracular text, the prophecies that you mentioned, I mean, it's such a catalyst for revolt because Egypt is under this autocratic government where there is very little that the Egyptian peasants can do when the famine comes. So it's interesting. I thought it was a really fascinating discussion we heard, and I'm going to read the book with interest. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. I'm so pleased that you're here, and and as someone who thinks a lot about grain supply, in the Ptolemaic period, it's wonderful to have your thoughts, and I think it is really true. Like Cleomenes is just hated in Egypt because he does what you're not supposed to do. He takes advantage, and once you have this resource of grain, and that resource just shoots up in price, then you're sitting on a gold mine, and so he's trying to do everything, that he can. And there was an amazing book that was very influential for me, thinking it was about the Victorian famine in China. And she really talks about heroes and villains come out of these narratives. And, this is a lot of sort of back, tracking, but people who alleviate suffering, are come out, very well in terms of that. They are, as the person I quoted was saying, generally not starving themselves. If they can afford to be generous. However, that generosity is what can save a people from, death. And Cleopatra, I think, doesn't she give Cneius Pompey grain? And that's one of these things that make people hate her. And then saying everybody should come bring their grain to Alexandria, is another sort of terrible thing that she does. And a lot of these prophecies then come out with intense anger towards Alexandria. And, the prophecy says, we're going to wipe these foreign belt wearers, off the map. And so it's very interesting for who's doing the squeezing, who's being squeezed. Thank you.
I wonder if just to build on what Andrew Monson was saying, the reason for anger is, of course, the justification of the autocratic extractive system is that it can ensure cosmic peace and prosperity, and therefore its failure is all the more striking. Catherine Merridale, in her discussion of Russia, makes a lot of religion, and peasant religion, the Russian orthodoxy, and its encounter with famine is like at the heart of the book. What does famine and catastrophe, what effect do they have on religion, on Egyptian traditional religion specifically? I know you talked a bit about this with the pessimistic religion. That seems to me, pessimistic literature, but it seems to me that the whole framework of this whole worldview has to be taken into account.
Yeah, I mean, it's. Oh, I'm sorry. All right. In that literature, this is literature of people grappling, and basically religion is, people say, I would pray to God, but I don't even know where he is, which may go with solar veiling, frankly, in part because there's the gods are distant and they're no longer there. And yeah.
Famines, we know this from all the comparisons to
Yeah.
seeing dead bodies in the street is normal.
Yeah.
Right? And seeing dead bodies floating in rivers, seeing dead children, that's normal. How does that work in Egyptian society where death seems to be isolated in such a way?
Well, I mean, that's in all of those pessimistic texts. The most pessimistic is, the bodies that you move aside to get to the water. That there's death everywhere. I mean, it's just a sort of, it's sort of termed as a sort of, aporia, like, just to like. I can't even, it's how I feel when I look at the newspaper right now, it's like, and then to live through it, like what you need to do is get through the day, and you see this sort of, this deep lament that's really terrible, and this realization that nobody's going to save you. And that's the sort of difference between, I think, hero narratives and the kind of two moaners, the people saving the day, and then the total lack of heroes in the pessimistic literature where you're really alone, and there's not even a God who's coming to help. So, it's not a good, it sounds like religion, like cross-culturally, you get an emphasis spiking with religion and then it trailing away when things are just so terrible that you like nobody's helping. Oh, good. Yes, Neve.
Thank you. I think I can use my voice. Oh, sorry.
I know it's
Sorry for being unbearable. Thank you very much. The book is, of course, fabulous and fascinating. As everybody said, there's so many things there that leave you then wanting to run back to the stele and to the text and to think about now, the future, and the past. And one thing that came to me, and I kind of wonder if you also saw it through your kind of work, is the question of resilience, and especially how language is involved in it. So Seneb starts his text by saying, I wish I had different new, strange words and utterances that are unusual, because, and Parkinson wrote about that, because literature doesn't make sense anymore. And it's the failure not of literature, but of our time that don't stand up to it. And so, but then when you look back and read those, what looks like annoying cliches of the first intermediate period, let's say, I fed the hungry, I gave cloth to the, it almost feels like they're insisting on something that everybody knows doesn't make sense. It's not how life works, but they're trying to say, yes, it is. Let's just say for now it works. So in all these like memories and famine, there's in a way that's almost like in the feast part, in the carnivalesque part, there's like almost like the belief of like, okay, this now is awful, it's dreadful, but maybe tomorrow, like maybe we'll get to celebrate it again in a different way. So I wonder again, sorry for the long
Yeah, no,
comment.
that's lovely. That's lovely. Thank you. Comments from someone who thinks very deeply about Egyptian literature. Oh, okay, I was already still on. I'm totally failing with the mic. Sorry. So Kaka Sanub is fascinating because he is grappling with, I wish I had new words, and two things make people throw him out. One is the fact that his name shows that he didn't live in the first intermediate period because it's based on a Middle Kingdom king. So is he claiming a trauma that he didn't live through? And then the other thing is that he's just like over the top, and this is sort of, people are like, come on already, like he's saying it that there's my heart doesn't know, but in reality, or not in I don't mean to say in reality, but when you look at people writing, and particularly this comes out with people writing about the Holocaust, is that that's very much the kind of that Dominic LaCapra writes about, that with trauma, that language fails, and that you need a new language. And people say about that with hunger, is that that this is Primo Levi talks about with hunger, that you can't say hunger about the hunger that you experience in starvation. It's not that. People think they know what hunger is, but it's a whole language has failed. We don't even know it, and the only thing that you can do is sort of say it louder, or cover yourself in dirt, like how do you amplify something that was already at a level. And then what's interesting, that sort of elite boast that I fed the hungry, it's like, okay, you better have, like, and there's very much what came out in a lot of what I was reading about with the siege of Leningrad, where people were under siege for 2.5 years, is that anybody who looks like they're well fed comes in for a tremendous amount of hatred, and so that you need to feed the hungry, not only to be a good person and get through the gates of the next world, but you need to feed the hungry, or else they're going to turn on you and run you out of your home. Or so it's interesting. Stock, this kind of thing makes you read things differently, and so that I fed the hungry is an interesting thing.
Should we be wrapping up now? Okay. I don't want you to flip it and talk about feeding the hungry, but I think there is I think we should continue this conversation over a glass of wine.
Thank you.